So we're going to cover a number of different things here. There's 5 different major things. We'll look at the level of conflict, which has been happening globally. That's at record levels. There are a number of factors with that we'll come to. We'll look at the concept of geopolitical fragmentation, which is something we've been studying. In many ways, that's fueling some of the underlying issues for the increases we've got in conflict. And we'll come back and look at the conflict clusters. These are very important. Quite often we think in terms of a conflict and 2 parties. But when we look at it in more detail, you get conflicts, cluster conflicts, which involve many countries and many different groups inside those countries and proxies from the outside. We'll look a little bit on AI warfare and the use of drones, which is really quite interesting. And then we'll come back and we'll look at the potential of the Iran war to be a multiplier. And I realise it's settled down at the moment, but it could break out again. So we'll just move through the key findings of the report. So let's just have a look at some of the headline numbers. This is the 12th year running that peace has actually deteriorated. And that's an awful long run. Decreased by 0.7%. Now, that doesn't mean much to anyone, but we had 99 countries deteriorate in peace. That's the most which has deteriorated in any one year since we started the Global Peace Index 20 years ago. So most since the inception. Cost of violence, the global economy, keeps on going up. So it's up to $22 trillion currently, and we'll come back to more on that later on. And 7 of the 8 regions in the world deteriorated. 1 improved, probably the one you wouldn't think is going to improve, which is the Eastern and Central Europe. So the Ukraine and Russia are in that region. And if we come back and we look at the number of countries which are now deteriorated since the inception, it's 103. We cover 163 countries globally, so that'll give you an idea of just how big the decrease has been, and that covers about 99.7% of the world's population. And this will give you a quick idea of a mud map of the world. Red is very, very bad. Green is very, very good. You'll note Australia's green. So if we're looking at Australia this year, it's 20th on the Global Peace Index. It's up 4 places since where it was last year, which probably surprises most people in the room. So why did it increase? That'll surprise you even more. And that's because a decrease in militarisation, which means we've put the budgets up, but we're not actually spending the money yet. So they're not our figures, we get them from IISS and CIPRI, which are the 2 authoritative figures on counting a military expenditure. So this will give you an idea of the countries at the top. You'll note that 6 of them are in Europe, 3 of them are in Asia, and 1 of them is in the middle of the Atlantic. That's Iceland. And Iceland's at the top of the index. It's been there now for the 20 years since inception. A lot of people grab the joke, well, it's the only reason it's so peaceful, it's too cold to go outside. That's wrong. So if you look at the history of the country's history actually builds in its peace. And so if we go to the bottom end, these are the other ones here. Note Ukraine slightly increased. Russia stayed the same, and it's at the bottom of the index. It was at the bottom of the index last year too. Every one of these countries is trapped in conflict. And so you've got concept of through systems thinking, you've got the concept of the conflict trap, very, very hard to get out of. But what we notice at the other end, the countries which are very, very peaceful remain peaceful. And that's because of the qualities of positive peace, which this presentation's not about. But that's something you should all follow and look up and understand. So this gives you an idea of the biggest improvers, the 5 countries. So we've got Poland. That's really because of a lessening of the suppression there. Gabon, it's come off very low, but that's after a coup, and now it's settling down after the coup. Litho, Ukraine's up slightly, and Turkey after it did a deal with the PKK. If we go to the other end now, we can see the ones which have fallen. Nepal's the one which has fallen the most. That's really due to the Gen Z riots and then the repressive response. Chad, because of internal conflict. DRC's the same. Pakistan, because of the relationships with India and the small war they fought there, and then also the issues with Afghanistan as well. Now, this will give you an idea of the conflict deaths and where they're occurring globally. There's a couple of things. So there are 181,000 people killed in conflict last year. That's the second most since the inception of the index 20 years ago. The most was 2 years ago, and that was with the Ethiopian war, and it's just over 300,000. So it's a long way off that, but still a very, very high figure. But there are some things which are absolutely sobering this year. And so what we find is that there are 20 countries now which have recorded over 1,000 deaths, and that's the most we've had since the inception of the GPI. So that gives you an idea of just how much it's spreading, even though the top line figure is the most. So okay, let's have a little bit of a look at the trends, see where they're going. So this will give you an idea of the trends. When you're looking at our graphs, going up generally is bad, coming down is good. It's an inverted measurement scale we use. And this will give you an idea of just the changes. And so as you can see here, it's been a long while since, it's 12 years since we've had an improvement. And as I mentioned, 119 countries have deteriorated. So this will give you the idea of the indicators which have deteriorated. Violent demonstrations has had the biggest decline over the last 20 years. We can see only a small number have increased. If we look after that, the next three indicators with the biggest declines are all related to conflicts. And then you've got the relationships with neighbouring states as well. They're the ones with the biggest decline. The biggest improvement is in commitments to UN peacekeeping, but that's a little bit funny, if you like. The reason for that is that the number of peacekeeping missions have dropped, and that's because it's a lot more difficult for the Security Council to actually improve them. So number of the expenditure on peacekeeping missions is down 22%, number of peacekeepers is down 24%, and so a lot of the countries are holding their funding the same, so you've actually seen an increase in the commitments to the peacekeeping operations, if that makes sense to everyone. All right, now we'll move into the great fragmentation. So this is, I think, fascinating. So if we look at it and we go back, what we've seen is and this is a measure of influence, okay? It's measured along a number of different lines. So it's political, it's military, it's trade, and it's financial. And so it's called an ethics score. And what happens is, what we can see is all this is fragmented globally, the influence around these things, and that started at the global financial crisis. And so we can see in a lot of the work we do, the global financial crisis, in retrospect, and you only ever see it in retrospect, was an actual change or the start of a new era. And so that's part of what we can see here. Now, if we're looking at trade as a percentage of GDP, that's flatlined. And that's over probably about the last 4 to 5 years. Prior to that, trade as a percentage of global GDP was increasing year on year on year. And so, as we can see today, the forces against globalisation are changing. You can see it in China, you can see it in the US. In China now, they're restricting exports, both by domestic companies and by foreign countries, so they can keep the stuff inside. You've got a lot of restrictions coming in. They're now putting more tariffs on a lot of goods. And so obviously we're aware of what's happening in the US, but you have this happening in China as well. And you'll see it copied by a number of other countries around the world as well. So this will give you an idea of just the spread of the geopolitical power. There's two superpowers, US and China. Then you've got a number of middle-level powers. So you've got the two superpowers. Then you've got the great powers, and there's 7 of the great powers. We'll come to them in a minute. Then we come down to middle-level powers, and then finally the rest of the world. You'll note the biggest gap in this diagram is in Africa. So the green are emerging powers, but ones which aren't quite to middle-class power. And so part of the issues in Africa, you've got no one who's regionally strong to actually try and dominate and create the peace, which you have in many parts of the world. And you'll see later on in this presentation, a lot of outside influence comes in which affects it. Now, if you look at this, this gives an idea of the influence map globally. Red, you'll find, is the Chinese influence. Blue is the US influence. And the ones which you see, purple, they're the ones where you've got strong influence from both. And so as you can see, there's lots of competed territories. And you see Australia as one. That's we've got the defence and economic relationships in many ways with the US, but our exports are really dependent on the China. Now at this stage you've got 40 different countries globally now which see themselves as being influenced by both powers. And many of them are really trying to walk an independent path between that. But what's interesting, what we can see with influence now, is when we're looking at the superpowers, both of them seem to have plateaued in terms of influence. And now, what's happened, we can see there's been, over the last 20 years, 25 years, there's been a lot of loss of power by what we call as the great powers. And those great powers, a lot of them have come out of Europe. So we can see now, since 1995 to 2023, about 18 years, we can just see that Germany's halved in the size of its percentage of GDP. We can see a similar sort of, Japan's even worse, going from the 80s, late 80s when it peaked. We can see France, a similar sort of drop. We can see Italy with a similar sort of drop, but note India. So of the great powers, it's the only one rising. So we can see its percentage of GDP has gone from 1.1% up to 3.5%. Now, can anyone guess where Australia's gone in this time? If the countries we're most similar to have deteriorated, what would happen to Australia?
Deteriorated.
That would be the logical conclusion, but it's not true. So Australia's share, if we went back to 1991, which I did the figures for, it was 1.4% of global GDP. We're now at 1.6% of global GDP. So the government can pat itself on the back. But the reason for that really is the increase in iron ore prices and other precious metals. So that's what's really fueled it. That loss of influence, where has that been picked up? It's been picked up by a whole group of middle-level powers. And so we can see here, it gives you an idea of the number of rising middle-level powers and also the number of emerging powers which might get there. So here are some of these rising middle-level powers. They're places like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, just to name some, and Israel. Now, Australia is a middle-level what we'd see as a middle-level power, and has been that way for a long while. So there's two groups, the established group and the rising group, or the newcomers or the rising group. The established group are very, very much aligned with Western values and Western democracies. The rising group are not, and they're trying to seek their own way and have their own influence in the territories in which they operate. Focus on this one is you have a look at the graph on your left-hand side. And what you'll see there, if you look at the blue, that's the number of internationalised interstate conflicts. So it'll give you an idea, and they're the ones which have increased the most. So that's where you've got involvement from outside nations in the conflicts. If we go over the other graph, the key part here is the yellow. And so if you're looking at the yellow, what you can see is the number of peace agreements from about the 1970s down to the 2010s, it's gone from 23% to 4%. And so the reason we've got this increase in conflict is simply because we aren't able to solve the conflicts going on. And that's partly because of the nature of these conflict clusters and the way they're interspersed. You've got these rising middle-level powers, which means you've got a lot more dynamics around competition, around power as well. And so they're a couple of the underlying drivers. So we come back to this now. This will give you an idea of conflict systems map. So if you start to look at this, we go over here. This is Afghanistan, Pakistan. It moves over into Iran, down through the Middle East, come over here to the Horn of Africa, and we move right over to the West Coast. So you can see it's one connected group, but they are distinct, different conflict clusters. The only one out of it's the Andean conflict cluster, which is down in Central and Latin America. An interconnection of these conflicts, and so that's a real concern as we move further on. Now, there are a number of different reasons which cause conflicts to spread. So if we come back and have a look at the Horn of Africa, this will give you an idea of just the Horn of Africa and the different countries there. So these are the countries which are involved in the conflict. The ones in blue down the bottom aren't necessarily there yet, but they all have the potential to become involved in this conflict. And so what we find is you've got organisations from the Middle East involved. So you've got people like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey. They're all engaged in these conflicts, particularly Sudan. So you've got conflict between Ethiopia, Eritrea. Eritrea is funding rebels inside Ethiopia. Ethiopia wants to have a port because it's landlocked. It sees a way of getting that is straight through Eritrea. And so you've got southern Sudan, and you've got different groups from southern Sudan, obviously moving up into Sudan as well. And so there are 9 different things which cause conflicts to spread. And so those 9 conditions are all present in the Horn of Africa. So there are things like bad relationships with neighbours, the movement of guns and people, the transfer of people through escaping conflict, so migration flows. It can be the ability to be able to have resources which can internally be taken by the groups to fund them. That's gold in this case. There's a big vein of gold running through the Horn of Africa. That gets exported up into the UAE, for example. You've got things like the issues between tribes. So you've got intertribal conflict where you've got one tribe moving over a border, particularly if the 2 countries are hostile. So they're just some of the kind of reasons. Just to give you an idea, but you've got 12 million refugees now in Sudan alone. Like that's just terrible. So if we come back and have a look at this, this gives you an idea. So what we see as one of the real issues is the spread, the conflict, and the conflict in the Middle East or the greater Middle East merging with the Horn of Africa. If that was to occur, you'd have 24 countries engaged. You've got the Straits of Hormuz, that'd be closed. You've got the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, that would be closed, as would the entranceways probably to the Suez Canal. Because what we can see is a number of different accesses of how this could come about. And partly if you saw an alliance between the UAE, Israel and Egypt on one side, on the opposite side, you'd have Saudi, Egypt and Turkey. It'd be Israel, Ethiopia and the UAE. So if they formed along lines, that then would fuse the 2 conflicts. That would then end up involving 24 countries and be exceptionally difficult to unlock. So just to have a quick look at AI and warfare. So this will give an idea of just the increase in drone attacks. This is just looking at the number of the blue lines, the number of in Ukraine. That'll give you an idea of the way it's gone up. So we went back a year ago, they were producing 1 million. They're now up to 2.4 million. They expect to increase up to 5 million within the next year. If we look at it, there were last year 565 different organisations launched drone attacks. And so that's incredibly large numbers. So that's governments, military with governments, it's militias, it's criminal gangs and drug cartels. So the use of drones is increasing at a massively fast rate. And the use of those drones, in many ways, when you combine it with AI, now starts to create frightening concepts. So if you went back to, let's say, the 1980s, it took about a day to work out if you were going to do a strike, how to go about and get the logistics of the strike. The US today is down into under sub 10 minutes from the time they can identify a target to the time they strike the target. So Israel, using AI, identified 37,000 people in Gaza, which are either sympathetic to Hamas or members of Hamas. Now, when they're in full operational mode and they're launching strikes, they have 20 seconds gap in which for a human being to interfere and determine whether it's a false positive. The number of false positives they get off their own admission is more than 10%. So that creates a whole lot of ethics or issues around the use of AI and around the use of drones, particularly as the drones get more and more autonomous. Russia's using autonomous drones, the UK is too, and you'll find more countries doing it as we move forward. So the question is, like, really, what are the regulations which should be around drones? When should you use them? And what amount of human intervention should there be? I don't think we're going to get an answer to that, but it's something which really needs to be raised. So if this all comes with a cost too. So if we're looking at the cost of global economy, it was 22 trillion last year. About 70% of that expenditure goes into the military, into private security. Now, if you want to create peace, you have to invest in peace. And as we can see with peacekeeping operations, that's going down. If it's going down, then wouldn't we expect there to be more war? Now, we spend more money on military, that means we're gearing up for war. But if you want to create peace, you've got to invest in peace. So currently, depending on how you count, it's 0.1% to 1%, 0.1% to 1%, the expenditure on the military is actually spent on building peace. And peace can be built in many ways. It can be with diplomatic efforts, it can be with mediation organisations, it can be with peacekeeping operations, and it can even be well-targeted developmental aid. Now, if we're looking at the cost of the Iran war, when we come back, we did a detailed analysis on that. So at this stage, it's somewhere between 0.6 and 1.6% of the cost. So if we went back and we have a look at the global financial crisis, that was about 3.5%. COVID was just over 3%. So at this stage, the Iran war will have impact, but nothing like what you found, which went on with those other two crises. However, if it's a 1.6% reduction in GDP, most of Europe is forecast to grow by 1 to 1.2% this year. So it'll be enough to send Europe into recession if the conflict flares up again and gets worse. Anyway, that's the end of the presentation, so I'll stop there.